My name is Brooke. I'm operations manager here at BISG, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to Marketing for Rights Professionals. We've got two fantastic speakers today, Clare Hodder, co-founder and director of Rights Zone, and Chris Kleeman of Kleeman and Company, who's also the chair of BISG's Rights Committee. Just a couple of brief housekeeping notes. This session will be recorded, so if you do have to hop off early for any reason or you want to share this with your colleagues, that recording will be distributed to everybody who registered, so not to worry there. We also ask that you reserve the chat for space talking about the webinar and any questions that you have around the content. We will have time for questions after the fact, so we'll have that Q&A at the end. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat or the Q&A function. We'll make sure that we get to those. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to the wonderful Chris Kleeman. Hi, Chris.
Everybody. I love seeing, like all good rights conversations, multiple time zones in the chat. So welcome. It's great to have you here. Brooke already mentioned a little bit about Clare. I just want to introduce her. And also, we'll talk a little, maybe at the end, about the great rights committee meetings we have and how we would welcome more participation, and you can check in with us about that if you're interested. We have some interesting projects going on, and you'll hear when I talk about Clare that she's very much involved in these things. So let's get to Clare's content as quickly as possible because she's a lot of interesting things to say. Brooke already mentioned Clare is the co-founder and director of Rights Zone. That's a software solution which has the tagline of the rights licensing system by rights people for rights people. And Clare also runs the Rights 2 consultancy. She's been in rights management for over 25 years in publishing houses that range from academic, professional, and trade. She has worked in-house and has advised as a consultant publishers of all sizes, from global publishing giants to the small indie press, and then has worked a lot with industry organizations and various service providers. Rights Zone is a BISG member company, and Clare is a dedicated participant to the monthly rights committee discussions, and also a big part of our working group, the Rights Committee Working Group, which is currently working on royalty statement standards. We have high hopes, and I know many of you also do, that royalty statement reporting from publishers we license to, particularly publishers we license to for translation rights, can begin to follow a standard and help us clear up and save time around that little piece of admin that's so important to all of us in agencies and in publishing rights departments. So that's a really important piece of work that's ongoing. And again, happy to have participation from anyone who's interested. So let me turn this over to Clare. And I know we're all anxious to hear some tips and tricks. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to Brooke and BISG for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to just crack straight on. Today I want to share with you how I believe that rights professionals can leverage some of the tried and tested techniques that marketeers use in order to maximise the potential of our rights businesses. And I think it's fair to say that when we're learning to sell rights, we might get training in things like copyright law, negotiation, contract drafting, and we might also get some sales training. But rarely do we actually get taught anything about marketing. But in fact, much of what we do is really closely aligned with what marketeers do every day. So this is a picture of the marketing funnel. Some of you might be familiar with this already. It was actually conceived in 1898, so it's been around for a while. And the first version of this funnel used an acronym AIDA, AIDA, awareness, interest, desire, and action. It's been through various iterations and refinements since then, and you'll see all sorts of different versions of marketing funnels, some with more or less layers and ever-evolving shapes. I've just picked a fairly simple version for the basis of what we're going to cover today. And the role of the funnel is that it maps out a customer's journey with you, from the point at which your customer first becomes aware of you or your product, through to them taking an interest, considering making a purchase, actually buying something, and then remaining a customer and hopefully making repeat purchases. You'll see on the left-hand side the stages that we might perceive them from the seller's perspective, and on the right-hand side as they might be perceived from the buyer's point of view. And the customer journey today is obviously not quite as straightforward as it was in the 1890s. And in particular, the digital habits of customers mean that people don't just start at the top and get funneled through to the bottom. They can come in and out of the funnel at almost any stage. And I've borrowed my heading from this next stage from Todd Unger, author of the 10-second customer journey, who calls it the tornado funnel. He says, the traditional funnel has been tossed in the air and whipped around, mixing the individual steps in the customer journey together and mashing it all into a new customer experience, one that is rapid, one that is unpredictable, and one that is constantly changing. And it occurred to me when I came across marketing funnels that these stages are actually a pretty close reflection of the rights buyer's customer journey. So I started to research marketing funnel stages in a bit more depth to see if they would reveal any insights that we as rights professionals could learn from. So you'll see on this next slide that I've renamed the funnel the rights funnel, and I've mapped out the stages of the rights customer journey onto each segment, and they fit really quite neatly. Like the tornado funnel, rights buyers do also come in and out at various stages. They don't necessarily take a linear path. But for the purposes of today, I'm just going to keep things simple, and we'll work through each of these stages as we go through the webinar. But first, I want to talk about the customer first focus, which is in the title of the webinar. And way back in 1954, in Peter Drucker's book, The Practice of Management, he said, the purpose of business is to create and to keep a customer. So focus on customers is not a new idea, but it has become increasingly important in a world where more of our customer interactions are digital than human to human. And customer first strategy or customer obsession have become really big buzzwords over the last few years, with more and more businesses focused on customer experience. There are now even C-suite roles. You might have heard of a CXO or customer experience officer. This next quote is from an article from Forrester Research, and it says, businesses that have their customers at the core of everything create sustainable success and continually outperform the competition. And the article goes on to summarize what it means to be customer obsessed. It's a holistic approach running through an entire business. It's about knowing your customers, anticipating and fulfilling their needs, and exceeding their expectations. And I've highlighted a couple of key phrases at the end of this quote: building deep emotional connections and long-term loyalty, because I think that they really resonate with those of us involved with rights selling. The nature of rights work means that in some parts of the customer journey, we're adopting a customer first approach to our interactions, whether we are consciously aware that that's what we're doing or not. And it's through this lens of customer obsession that I want to really look at how our customer journeys through the rights funnel. So right at the top of the funnel, we've got find and attract customers. At this stage, it's all about identifying who our target customers might be and trying to get them to take an interest in what we have to offer. So at one level, if I ask you to define who your customers are, you'll probably be able to give me a pretty good answer based on your experience. You might say foreign rights agents, film and TV producers, or software developers, but can you go deeper? Who are you actively engaged in sales conversations with? Who has bought rights from you? Which customers have delivered the best long-term value to your business? Do parts of your list appeal to some customers, but not others? What about the deals that didn't progress? Are there patterns that you're observing that could help you to predict future behavior? To answer those sorts of questions, you'll need to consult the data you've collected in the course of doing your rights business. And whether you have a WYSI database, a plethora of Excel spreadsheets, or a large email archive, you have data. And as we'll see as we go through the funnel, getting into the habit of collecting, reviewing, and taking action informed by data is a really valuable lesson that we can take from our marketing colleagues. So you might be able to start dividing your customers into more distinct groups based around their common needs. These are often broken down into categories like behavioural, psychographic, attitudinal, demographic, and geographic. More relevant for B2B users might be the category that they call firmographic. So that's things like what industry they work in, how many employees they have, what's their turnover and their growth rate. And this process of dividing up your customers into groups is a way of working out which type of customer is most likely to buy what you're offering, and therefore which segments you should focus your marketing activity on. In rights, we might segment based on the type of right being purchased, geographical location, a business's capacity for buying rights, or the sorts of content that they're interested in. And of course, our customers change and their needs change, and the way that we meet those all change over time. So using data to understand each segment and our customers is always a work in progress. The segmentation process enables you to get a sense of who your ideal target customer is, and market professionals often bring ideal target customers to life through something called personas. A persona is a fictional model of someone who represents your target customer. You can create an image of what they look like, define their job, their interests, their needs. A persona helps you to build up a more rounded view of your prospective customer, and it can really help you bring clarity to your customer interactions and particular decisions you might make. Now, we don't have time to do a persona exercise right now, but that's something you could think about doing after the webinar. There are lots of online tools available. Canva has some templates you can customize, and just as an example, here's one I made earlier. In this example, I've got a persona called Katrin. She is the publishing director responsible for non-fiction books in a German publishing house. And I've given her some aspirations and challenges that I know from interactions with customers in her segment, things that someone in her role might experience. And from there, I can start to get a much clearer picture about what her needs might be. And you can create multiple personas to reflect your ideal target customer in each segment if you find it useful. Segmenting customers is a helpful way to differentiate customer types so you can determine which segments you're going to proactively target. It can also help you to differentiate the different ways in which you plan to target them. You could decide to develop a marketing strategy to target all your customers, but how useful would that really be? You can see on the slide, it says that targeting everyone is targeting no one. When Katrin has a need for high quality content written by prestigious authors, Kurt, the tech bro here, who's looking to acquire my entire backlist to train his generative AI model, needs something completely different. Katrin is seeking quality, Kurt wants volume. So it doesn't make sense that we would use the same marketing approach for both of them. And our resources are limited, so being strategic and prioritizing which customer segments to target to grow our rights business is important. We can be proactive in the segments that we see the most potential in, and perhaps more reactive in others. And having determined which customer segments we want to target, we now need to look at how we can differentiate ourselves from others in the market. This is called positioning. And positioning helps us to establish our offering as unique. It sets us apart from others offering a similar product or service. You could think about the example of the bottled water industry. Essentially, they're all just selling H2O, but each brand is giving itself a different position in the market by the way it bottles and labels and prices its product. So even though they're essentially the same thing, they've positioned themselves at premium and more kind of basic and mid-range versions. And when we're thinking about positioning from a rights perspective, I think it plays out at two levels. Firstly, we can think about how our publishing brands are positioned and perceived in the market. And we all have marketing colleagues who do a really good job of that. And then there's also a sort of secondary part, which is what we do when we're representing the brand as rights professionals. How does one rights team differentiate itself from another who might be competing to win business from the same ideal target customer? So your publishing brand might position itself on production quality, the prestige of the authors, discovering new talent, award wins, being first to market, those kinds of things. Whereas a rights team might position itself based on speed of response, the quality of information being provided, the ease of which, how easy it is to negotiate with them, authenticity, their knowledge and understanding of customers, their aftercare. It's useful to remember that purchasing decisions might not always be about the books. So we've looked at segmentation, targeting and positioning, or STP as it's often abbreviated to. And STP is a foundational step in marketing because it's that process that helps you to clarify what your customers need, how you can help them meet those needs, and how you can do that better than anyone else, or more simply, just to understand your value proposition. So having worked through our STP exercise, that puts us in a really good position to think about how we can bring people into the top of our funnel. We know who we want to attract, and so now we can focus on how we market to those ideal target customers. And the sort of typical tactics that marketeers would use at this stage are things like content marketing, so blogs, videos, social media posts, search engine optimization, paid ads, press articles. And those are all tactics that could be worth considering depending on your business. But I think you're right, we often have a really clear idea of who our ideal target customer is. And more often than not, we can simply just look them up and make an introduction, or make ourselves discoverable in other quite straightforward ways. So I've grouped together some of the sorts of tactics that rights professionals would typically use. Things like, research, using online directories, web searches, events, not just book fairs. That it might be that conferences in particular areas are more relevant to your target customer. That's more likely where they're going to be hanging out. I've listed the commercial marketplace options on the screen. All of those on the screen actually did presentations at the Doing Rights Right meeting that BISG put on in January this year. You should also think about your own marketing materials and whether they are working as hard for you as they should be. It's surprising how often contact details are left out of rights guides, or how difficult it can be to find contact information for rights people on publisher websites. Another thing that might be useful is to look at other activities your marketing colleagues are doing and seeing if you can leverage those to increase awareness of rights availability. And finally, just thinking about referrals and recommendations, either from existing customers, maybe authors can help you make new contacts through their networks. And of course, we actually often refer each other. If I'm speaking to a foreign rights customer and they're interested in a particular field that I don't publish in, then I'll always try and recommend somebody I know who they could go and speak to. So your goal at this first stage of the funnel is to end up having made a connection with someone so that you can then move them further into your funnel. In rights, that's typically getting a name, an email address, because once you have a means of contacting your target, the next phase of your marketing can kick in. So that brings us down to stage 2, which is about engaging our buyers and making sure that we know that we are relevant to them. And typically the marketing tactics at this stage would involve contacting your target with emails, newsletters, social media content to demonstrate that relevance and how our products will solve their needs. And again, the work on segmentation, targeting and positioning means you're in good shape to determine what kinds of messaging is going to resonate best with your prospects. And rights specifically, I think I would add rights guides as a tactic here, and face-to-face pitching as well. So let's look at a few of these in more detail. Email is still considered one of the most effective B2B marketing tools, and certainly it's something that we as rights professionals do use a lot. But marketing emails do suffer from low open rates. I looked up some stats, and MailerLite have done some work this year and noticed that the average open rate for marketing emails is currently 42%, which is actually higher than previous years. But if you think about it, that just means that less than half of emails that are sent are actually read. And so if we're thinking in a customer first way, we need to consider why people aren't opening our emails. And in some cases, it's that the targets simply don't receive them because they've bounced, they've been marked as spam. In other cases, it might be that our emails are simply not of interest to those receiving them. So we do need to be smart about how we use emails. So some things to consider. Going back to segmentation, targeting, positioning, our messaging has to speak directly to the customer and address their needs. It needs to be relevant. It's not enough to say, here's a link to our new catalogue. Catherine gets hundreds of emails a day. She needs to know if she sees an email from me, it's going to be worth her while opening it. And when she opens it, I'm going to direct her to the half a dozen titles that I want her to focus on, rather than expecting her to review my whole rights guide. And obviously the message that I'm sending to Catherine is going to be very different to the one I'm sending Kurt, as we discussed earlier. So personalization, personalization and hyper personalization, again, are kind of one of the expected trends for this year. HTML emails have become more popular, but because they actively look like a sales message, they are more likely to be marked as spam. So the more you can personalize and make your email unique, the more likely it is that it's going to get through. And I'd actually just add that it's worth making sure your emails sound like they were written by humans. I think we've all started to spot some of the giveaways when something's been written by ChatGPT. We're great at building personal relationships in rights, so ensuring that we maintain those in our email communications, even when we're sending bulk emails, I think is really important. And just a few things to note about deliverability. Make sure your emails end up where you want them to go. So make sure your messages are properly authenticated. Talk to your IT colleagues about that. Create emails that people want to open. The more interaction your emails have, the less likely it is that they're going to be marked as spam. And clean your mailing list regularly. Don't send to people who never respond, as again, that's going to impact your open rate. And of course, on that note, always remember to add an unsubscribe option too. You could try a bit of experimentation with what marketers call A/B testing with emails. Essentially, that means sending one type of email to some contacts and a different style message to the rest, and then comparing the results to see if one version had a significantly better or worse reaction to the other. And that way you can see what's going to work best for you. Moving on to rights guides, these do remain a really useful tool, particularly for language and territorial rights sales. However, they do rather go against the grain of what we've been talking about with segmentation, targeting and positioning, because they tend to market to everyone. But we can craft rights guides that are customer focused by thinking about whether the information they contain is really relevant to the needs of the customers we're seeking to target, and that the contents are presented in an accessible way. I think it can be really tempting to stuff a whole season's worth of publishing into one rights guide, but has Catherine got time to read an enormous rights guide just to pick out a handful of titles that are going to fit her list? Probably not. What might work better is for me to send her a link, as we said earlier, and just say, like, these are the ones you should focus on. There are some quite cool innovations in rights guides these days. Children's publishers are starting to do lookbook style rights guides, which are very visually fun. But on the screen, I've got some examples from the academic world. Taylor and Francis have created some magazine style content for their rights guide. So they've got some in conversation with pieces to highlight key authors. There's a highlight section, which is sort of the more traditional full page per book information for sort of a limited number of genuine highlights, which have the broadest appeal. And then all of the other content is just arranged thematically by subject, but in a much briefer way, but still giving enough detail for subject specialists to hone in on what's of interest to them. And I think this is quite a clever way of organising what is otherwise a huge amount of information, and it's much more accessible than giving every book the same treatment. One of my bugbears is that rights guides, or the copy for rights guides, is often just a rehash of back cover blurbs. So you're using business to consumer messaging to make a business to business sale. You absolutely are not speaking directly to your target customer if you do that. And you're asking your customer to really work quite hard to pull out from copy aimed at an end reader as to why the book might be relevant to them as a rights buyer. It's not always possible to rewrite lots of marketing copy, I know, but maybe this is something where AI could help us out. So moving on to thinking about how we present titles with a customer first perspective when we meet people face to face. And as rights professionals, I think, lots of us really enjoy that kind of environment. It's where we thrive, being at a book fair or in a sales meeting and really, actually talking to people in real life. Sitting down with your customer and going through your rights guide from cover to cover is, I know you'll all be aware, not likely to be the most successful approach. And I think probably most rights people adopt what I've called an active listening approach. So talking to your customer, discussing what's happening in the market, seeking to understand more about their commissioning priorities, getting to know what their current challenges are before you leap in with a pitch. Even with customers well, things can change, so it's always worth having that conversation. And then you can use that information to guide the pitch that follows, picking out the titles that you think will work for them. And I've put some photos on the slide of some rights people deep in conversation with their rights customers at Frankfurt, and I love how engaged and focused they look in those pictures. And it's worth just noting that the time you spend not talking about your books is as important as the time you spend pitching. Getting to know your customer as a person, their interests, their hobbies, their family, friends, hopes, fears, and names of their pets. This is one of the best bits about working in rights, because it's that connection on a personal level that really cements the professional relationship and deepens your understanding of their needs. We know from our own anecdotal evidence as rights professionals that emotional engagement is critical, and it is really heartening that the research backs this up. The quotes on the screen are from Gallup, who found that 70% of purchasing decisions are based on emotional factors. And I think the second quote is one that really resonates. When people feel heard, feel special, and have their needs met, that's what builds the trust that's so critical in our business. And that is what makes your customer take a chance on the slightly random left field book you pitched them, because there was just something about it that you thought that they would love. The ultimate aim at this point in the funnel is to engage your customer, to show them something that's relevant, meets their needs, and critically for them to recognize it meets their needs and then causes them to journey to the next stage with you. So whether it's in your email, your rights guide, or as you're pitching, you need to include a CTA or call to action. This is a prompt for your customer to take that next step. A good call to action directs the next step using action verbs and demonstrates the value to the customer in taking it. It might also introduce a sense of urgency or evoke FOMO. In rights terms, CTAs at this point would often be aimed at getting your customer to request material to review. So here are some examples. I'm sure you'll come up with better ones. You'll see in this email one, I've tried to get some kind of fear of missing out in there. For this one and rights guide, it's just very short and direct, just a footer on each page, but very clear. And then a couple of face-to-face options there. And in all of these cases, all we're doing is trying to remove friction from the customer journey. We aren't making the customer have to work to think about what they have to do to take the next step. It's just clear and obvious. This is what I do. Before I leave this stage of the funnel, I'm just going to make another quick mention of data. Marketeers measure everything. They are always testing what works, tweaking, refining their approach. You could consider tracking the different approaches you take to engage your customers and then measuring the outcomes of those engagements in terms of whether or not they result in review copy requests or indeed later deals. And that might help you to understand which of your engagement tactics has had the best chance of success so that you know where to prioritize your time. So third stage, managing the submissions and review process. So up until now, we've been on what's known as the top of the funnel or TOFU. Hopefully we'll find that our calls to action have elicited some responses. We've received some requests to review material. The next stage is the point where our prospect is actively considering our offering. And it would be easy to assume that there's not actually very much we can do here to influence our prospects. We'll send them the material, they'll review it, and they'll decide whether it's a good fit or not. And whilst that's true to a certain extent, I think there are a few things we can do to support our customer in this process and to increase our chances of success. So how do we make sure our submissions are customer focused? Here are a few thoughts. We saw in that slide and that quote from Gallup that making a customer feel heard and feel special is important to building emotional connections. So you can template submission emails for efficiency, but it's very easy to just spend a minute topping and tailing with a personal note, and that can really elevate your communication. And it could be as simple as something like reminding your customer what it was about the book that had piqued their interest when you first discussed it. It's worth keeping a note of what your customers' preferences are in terms of what they want to see. Maybe you have someone who likes to see marketing plans, or who only wants you to send maybe a few chapters. But remembering their preferences is sending a signal to your customer that you're listening to them and you're taking care to meet their needs. And think about how your customers are going to access what you're sending. Again, what works well for one customer might not work so well for others. Large email attachments can clog up inboxes, so some customers prefer WeTransfer or Dropbox. For others, they'd rather not have to leave their mailbox to open a file. So just talk to your customers about what their preferences are, keep a record of them, and do what you can to comply with them. If you're sending out submission packages to more than one party interested in the same rights, I think it's really important to be clear about that up front and to make sure your customer knows what the process is going to be for receiving offers. Different rights people do work in different ways, so it really does pay to be clear so that your customer doesn't get any nasty surprises if they've been late sending something in and you have ended up selling the rights elsewhere. I put efficiency here, which is more an aspiration of mine rather than necessarily something I do. But in very general terms, the quicker you can be at supplying review material, the better chance you're going to have of getting a favourable response. Think about Catherine. Following a book fair, she might have 40 or 50 projects to review. If ours is among the first 1 or 2 to hit her inbox, it's going to have a much better chance of getting her attention than if it arrives 3 or 4 weeks later. Of course, there are other things that are going to come into play, but I think a speedy response does signal that you value the customer and you want their business. And all of these things, again, are about removing friction in as many places as you can to keep the customer journey smooth and making it easy for your customer to take the next step. Now, whilst there'll be times when prospects do get back to you promptly with a decision following the review process, more often than not, some form of follow-up is going to be required. There are all sorts of reasons why a customer might not respond quickly. Realistically, it might just be that your priorities don't match up, and so you are going to need a degree of patience. And whilst at one level the ball is in your customer's court and it's down to them to make a decision, you can do a few things to try and keep things moving forward. And obviously there's a fine line between leaving your customer to it and risking them forgetting about the book entirely, or repeatedly chasing them to the point where it's easier for them to just say no so that your emails stop coming. And I think this balance can be achieved by something called active patience. So things that you might be able to do that would count as active patience, perhaps agreeing realistic response times with your customer at the beginning of the process. That means that everyone's clear on the expectation, and it gives you a point in time by which it's reasonable to follow up by if you haven't heard from them. And then it's just a polite check-in to see how they're getting on. You might be able to get in touch with your customer because you've got some additional value add, some news to share. Maybe there's a prize win, some press coverage, you've secured another rights deal. You're not chasing per se, but you're providing some additional information of value. And that's then a fair exchange for the time they've had to spend opening and reading your email. You can always reach out to your customer to ask if there's anything they need, keeping things friendly and customer focused, asking questions, open questions about how they're getting on, what information they might need from you to help them come to a decision. I always say that to get a rights deal over the line, the stars have to align. It has to be the right book at the right time in the right market. So the odds of taking people to the next stage of the funnel for this particular opportunity might not be that high, But the good news is that if you've taken a customer-centric approach to get them to this stage, then you've substantially increased your odds of scooping them back into the funnel again with a different project, even if this one isn't the one. And you can increase those odds further with a bit of analysis. Why wasn't the project a good fit for your customer at that time? Seeking feedback is going to inform future recommendations, especially if you record that data for future reference. And that brings me again onto data. Given the number of rights deals on the go at any one time, I think careful management of the submissions process is really important. Each one of those submissions is a potential sale, and you need to remain aware of it in order to nurture it and try and ensure that as many as possible get through to the bottom of the funnel. And I'm often surprised when talking to rights people that not that many keep good searchable records of their submissions. Understanding how many prospective sales or leads are actually, how many prospective leads are actually converted into sales is a key metric for marketeers. It's known as the win rate, and it's calculated by dividing the number of customers won by the number of leads. And so in rights terms, that would be looking at the number of deals sold in a period and dividing that number by the number of submissions for the same period. So if we had 100 submissions in a year and that same year we made 15 rights sales, our win rate would be 15%. And establishing a baseline metric like that means that you can measure it over time. And you can observe changes and try and dig to find what causes those changes. For example, is our win rate the same across all types of rights sale, across all territories, across all kinds of books? Or in some areas, does our win rate get better or worse? Experimenting with making changes to your approach at the top end of your funnel will help you to see the impact it has on the win rate, and that can really help you decide strategically how you're going to manage your processes so that you can drive future growth. So, on to stage 4. To get down into this bottom part of the funnel, your prospective customer has really signaled their desire to make a purchase. So maybe they've made an offer, or perhaps they've asked you what your terms would be for a deal. But either way, in order to get them across the line, you're going to have some negotiating to do. Now, lots has been written about negotiation, and you'll develop your own approach. But I just want to have a quick look at how we might take a customer-centric approach to winning the business and getting the deal signed. So in the 1991 work, Getting to Yes, by Irian Fisher, the authors suggest 3 fair criteria with which to judge a negotiation. It should be wise, that is to meet the legitimate interests of each party to the fullest extent possible. It should be efficient, and it should improve, or at least not damage, the relationship between the parties. And they talk about positional bargaining, where the parties take fixed positions and then battle it out to try and find a settlement. And that might conclude with an agreement, but it's an agreement that rarely meets those 3 criteria. So instead, the authors suggest an integrative bargaining approach, where each side works to find a common solution, what we might call a win-win. And this is a great example, and apologies if you've heard it before, but the authors use this to demonstrate what they mean by integrative bargaining. 2 people quarrel over a piece of fruit. After arguing for some time, they agree to divide it in half. The first person ate the fruit from their half and threw away the peel. The second used the peel for a cake and discarded the fruit. If only they'd taken an integrative bargaining approach instead of a positional one, they may have ended up both getting what they wanted, the whole peel for one and the whole flesh for the other. And I think reaching wise, efficient and amicable agreements is definitely what we're aiming for in rights trading, and having win-win outcomes is really conducive to fostering those long-term positive customer relationships that we strive for. So how might that play out in the sorts of negotiations that we as rights people have with our customers? So just going back to Katrin, and I'm going to imagine for a moment that she's made me an offer, and it's an offer that I have found, frankly, a bit underwhelming. I could haggle over the value of the advance and royalty and try and push Katrin into paying more than she can realistically afford. Her response to that might be to make a counteroffer, or she might even walk away. Certainly, I'm not going to leave her with the best experience, and it might colour our future negotiations. Taking a more integrative and customer-friendly approach would mean having a discussion with her about her budget. In addition to buying the rights, she has to pay a translator on top of her usual production costs, and those costs are all front-loaded. She has to incur them prior to actually recouping any of her investment in the form of sales. So when Katrin's offering me a lower than expected advance, she's just seeking to reduce her upfront investment costs. My own interests are in maximising the value of the amount payable in advance, as it's the only guaranteed income on the deal. And whilst a higher royalty rate would be nice, in fact, that will only be relevant if the book sells through and earns out the initial advance. So in order to negotiate a solution, In order to negotiate a solution that works for us both, we could just ask Katrin if she can increase the advance but pay half on signature and the rest on publication. She spreads her costs, I get a higher guaranteed cash payment. Now that's a really common example in rights, but there are all sorts of ways that rights agreements can be negotiated creatively to match the interests of the parties. Things like varying the rights granted for an increase or decrease in payment amount, changing royalty escalators, varying contract duration, or restricting the breadth of the rights granted. The key is in understanding and continuing to clarify what's important to the other party in order to come up with an agreement that's going to work for you both. And I think it's perhaps just worth saying that obviously negotiation is not a requirement. If you have a fair offer that matches well with your requirements, there's nothing that is going to delight your customer more than you simply accepting it and moving straight to a contract. Establishing yourself in your customer's mind as someone that's straightforward and easy to work with is definitely not a bad thing. And that same integrative approach can apply to contracts as well, where buyers do ask for changes to your boilerplate agreement, ask questions about why they're required, and seek to understand the buyer's position to help you to identify a way forward. Regular pushback on the same clauses is suggesting that maybe your standard agreement could be more customer friendly. So have a look at how they're written and constructed. Expecting anyone to work through lots of archaic legalese is hard enough, but it is near impossible if you're dealing with people whose first language isn't English. So definitely worth taking a look at your agreements and seeing if you can make them nice and clear and easy to understand, really customer friendly. Again, making your contracts easy to sign is a way of removing more of that friction that we've been talking about. And the easier it is to sign, the quicker your deal will be concluded. And again, the quicker your deal's concluded, the quicker you're going to get money in the bank. So that's obviously really important. So moving on now to the final stage in our funnel, retention and loyalty, relationship management. In the 1898 version of the funnel, the sales process stopped at action. Once you'd sealed the deal, you could sit back and congratulate yourself on a job well done. But these days, we're aware that to get the best return on our investment, we need to keep the customers we've won coming back for more. It's much harder to go right back to the top of the funnel and get more customers in than it is to keep popping our existing customers back into the middle of the funnel and to cycle round again with them. Depending on which industry you're in, the estimated cost of acquiring new customers rather than selling to existing ones is anything from 5 to 25% more. The experience that our customers have had with us so far plays a huge role in ensuring that they want to be our customers again. And I think at this point, it's worth reflecting a little bit on the customer experience that we as rights professionals provide once the ink is dry on the contract. There are several processes and interactions that happen post-signature, and you can see some examples of the screen. And our customer-centric thinking needs to persist throughout all of those encounters. Some of these processes actually might sit outside our own area of responsibility, so there's a challenge for us in being able to influence colleagues to adopt customer-first thinking as well. What is it like to receive automated chases for unpaid advances every 30 days from a generic do not reply to this email address account from your credit control team? Then to have your customers' patient and repeated responses that they can't pay because you haven't supplied the relevant tax documentation completely ignored. What's it like for a customer when they're inching closer to their publication deadline and they're still waiting for you to send final approval of the proofs they sent weeks ago? An email which was met with an out-of-office response that said, sorry for the delay, but due to volume of work, it might take us around 6 weeks to get back to you. I think there's work that we can all do to improve this kind of post-contract process and be more customer friendly. Even little things like replying promptly to emails, even if it's just to say, I can't do this now, but I'll get back to you in a week or so. Offering to investigate problems, keeping people appraised of the actions you're taking or who their contact's going to be for the next part of the customer journey are all little things that we can do to make life easier for them. And just to note that good customer service, I think, is good for you too. I'm not going to dwell on these because we're short of time, but just to pick out a couple, Chris mentioned royalty statements and the good work that the BISG royalty statement standards working group is doing to try and improve some of the friction around managing these. But royalty statements and reviewing royalty statements gives you not only extra revenue if you make sure that you're getting them all in, but it also gives you great intelligence about how your books are performing in your licensees market. And marketers use a KPI that I think we in rights should probably use more often than we do. It's called lifetime customer value. And I think for rights, we could also talk about lifetime deal value. How much is the deal worth, not just in terms of the advances that you get, but those royalties that come and are paid over the life of the whole agreement. Rights is a long game, and we need to view our deals over the long term as well to really understand how valuable a particular customer is to us. There are various other things there. The other one that I'll just flag up at this point is authors. Authors are customers too. Without them, we'd mostly not have any rights to sell. And so the ability of rights teams to respond promptly to queries from authors or their agents about the status of rights deals or interest received is really important to your author's customer experience with the broader organisation. And our role in that process should not be overlooked. So, in order to manage and track the customer journey from the point of attraction through promotion, conversion and retention, you've really got to be on top of every part of the process for every customer and for every deal or prospective deal you're working on, especially when we're all working in tornadoes. Each customer goes through a funnel process for every book that we're talking to them about. So as well as coming in and out of the funnel all of the time, we kind of have time traveling customers because they're at different stages simultaneously. We're only human, and to manage any of this at scale, robust workflows and systems really are essential. As a software vendor, of course, I would say that, but I was a rights seller first, and it's because of this crazy tornado that I decided to work on creating a system that would help me through it. But this isn't a sales pitch, so I'm just going to refer you back to a report that BISG commissioned a few years ago. And it sets out very clearly the potential ROI benefits that publishers' rights teams can enjoy as a result of implementing rights management systems. If you haven't read it and you don't have a system that's pulling its weight for you, then I would strongly advise you take a look. And obviously, if you do want to talk to me at any time about RightZone and whether it's a good fit for your requirements, then do reach out to me and I can share more information. I've just put up on the right-hand side of the screen a virtuous circle that sums up how I've used systems throughout my rights career to grow my rights businesses. So that brings us to the end of our tour through the marketing funnel. Thank you for bearing with me. It was a lot of material to work through today. There are a few takeaways on the screen to summarize some of what we've looked at. And I think, firstly, I'd say we as rights professionals are generally very good at customer-centric thinking. There's almost a natural predisposition to be accommodating. So this kind of thinking isn't new to us, but maybe there are new applications that we hadn't thought about previously. I think it's important to pay attention to all areas of the funnel. Whilst retention is vital, it's not the whole story. We have to attracting plenty of new business at the top, nurturing our leads in the middle to make sure we get a good number of leads, a good number of sales flowing out at the bottom. And it's easy to lose sight of customer experience when we're under pressure. So aligning our objectives with those of our customers, removing friction from the customer journey is going to make it much easier for us to delight and therefore ultimately grow and retain our customer base. And there's a central thread running through the whole customer journey, which is about tracking and learning from rights data, using it to identify opportunities as well as potential blockages or leaks in your funnel will help ensure that you keep all those leads in and ultimately win more rights business. And finally, sometimes in rights, you can't always compete on product, but you absolutely can compete on customer experience. For a customer, knowing that the process will be easier, quicker, and more pleasant with you might just be enough for you to win the business. And I'm going to leave you with this reassuring quote from a recent Forbes article on emerging business trends in 2025. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have, and I will hand back now to Chris.
Oh, it's so good, Claire. Thank you. That funnel, that tornado funnel is quite intimidating, but the good news is we're all in it together. The customer's in it with us. So I think it's might be a situation where taking, what's the martial arts thing where you take the energy and use it to your advantage. I want to go back and focus on positioning. I love that you ended with the part about a rights person or a rights department or an agency practice being a big part of the decision making for a customer. One of the things that also comes up is the title itself, the author herself. That is another piece of the positioning, right? You have your company reputation and the way your company does things, sometimes even an editor, but where the title fits in a series or in a category can really make a difference. And that can sometimes be where the pressure comes from also. As much as we think we can make a deal that might be easy, and we're looking at the next title, the next book we might sell to someone, sometimes we really we aren't allowed to operate that way. We need to make the biggest possible deal for this book for a variety of reasons for our company and the author. What do you think? Sorry, I just want to ask, I was looking at some of the questions, and I do want to say there's so much in this presentation, and I think maybe it's worth you saying to us, Claire, what do you think is a small thing someone can do, or a place to start for someone who's not already tracking all of these levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in case you didn't hear me say it enough, I think looking at your data, just having a look, poking around, seeing kind of what you can draw out about who your customers might be, where your priorities are. And then, start at the beginning. Think about, where can I go to find some new customers? If you're looking into a new area, perhaps a new type of right or a new market, just start there and start doing that research and just putting your customer first hat on from the very beginning. Or simply when you're replying to emails over the course of the next week, every time you get an email from your customer, just draft your email and then think, right, customer first. Have I answered this email in a way that makes it easier for my customer to take that next step to pull them onto the next process? When you come to start preparing your rights guides for Frankfurt, which I guess won't be too far away, it's again just maybe just keep thinking, right, put my customer first hat on here. What am I going to do? So I think it's maybe just a mindset switch that you can bring with you to each of your kind of everyday jobs that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. Just even as we've segmented our publishers and contacts, segmenting our titles and thinking about not just the giant rights guide. These are all the things I have, but pulling them down into smaller sets of titles, not even
Yeah.
necessarily by category, just, pushing through ideas
Yeah,
for
I
the
mean, you'll
most
know
accessible books.
when you look through your rights guide, right? You always know the ones that nobody's going to be interested in. So
Yeah.
if you know that at the beginning, do they need to be there? Could you handle them in a different way?
Right. I've also found that it's really interesting to do analysis, front list, backlist, customer, total revenue, or however you want it, number of deals, and to be able to say to a customer, you're my top customer.
Yeah.
That to really validate that relationship in a way that, makes them understand too, that we're in this together to try and come up with a program that works for both sides. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Brooke. I think you wanted to
absolutely.
call some questions out.
We do have some questions that have come into the Q&A. So first off, what do you think about using direct mail to bring people into the funnel or as a follow-up?
I wonder if do they mean paper mail? I don't know. That's what we used to refer to as direct mail. So I imagine that if that's what the question is, then I don't imagine it will be very effective simply because of the spread of where people are. If it's direct email, then yes, it's great. But as I said, be careful about where you're getting those lists from. So I would make sure that you have, verified who the people are that you're looking to make contact with. Often mailing lists that you can buy are not segmented and targeted in the way that you would do it yourself. So I will probably shy away from that, or at least do some very hands-on editing of that kind of thing. And then, just being wary of things like whether, making a conscious decision about whether you want to use HTML email or not. Maybe again, doing some A/B testing to see, which format of email is more likely to be delivered than not.
Thank you. What, in your experience, helps to move the needle with management to move towards implementing technology that helps grow awareness of what's available for licensing and therefore helps to grow sales? Do you have any magic words?
That's a great question, and I don't know if any of you follow me on LinkedIn. You'll be able to know that I spend a lot of time trying to kind of bang the drum for rights people and try and raise awareness of what we're doing. I think again, sorry to keep mentioning it, does go back a bit to data. The more evidence that you can share with your senior leadership team about the value of your rights business, and that's not just the financial value, but also things like the impact it has on your authors, and the sort of the reach that your content is getting as a result of licensing deals. Look at sharing data from those royalty statements about how many sales are being made, that kind of thing. I think the more that you can talk to them and evidence what you're doing and saying, if you can help me by investing in technology, I can do more of this. That's an argument that they tend to listen to.
We have a couple people that have asked kind of a similar question. For a micro publisher with few resources, what's the best thing I can do to ensure that rights are not forgotten in our business?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question. I think you need to have someone who is a rights champion within your organization, and that can often be somebody, it's just a tiny part of their role, but it's a part of their role that gives them an opportunity to do something interesting. So if you've got an administrator or an assistant that could do with a little bit of something extra or an area of responsibility to give them, then rights is a great thing, because they can, it's one of those things, the more attention you give rights, the more it gives back. So when you ignore it, if you're still getting deals coming in, that's a good sign. You're still getting reactive deals. But if you can give someone responsibility for it, to champion it, make it part of somebody's job description, then that's, I think, a really good place to start. And I've seen that work well with lots of smaller publishers over the years.
Well, we are at time, but we have a couple more questions. If you have a moment and you're willing to stay on for just an extra minute or two, Claire.
No problem.
Fabulous. Do you have just one win rate for worldwide all languages for translation rights, or do you segment your win rates by language, type of book, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to have at least one, but absolutely, I think for it to be really useful, you probably want to kind of think about what your win rate is for different segments, however you decide to divide up your list, but absolutely type of right or geographical territory or language or whatever works for your business. I think, it can be very easy to get sucked into a big kind of data sideline where you spend more time analyzing your data than selling rights, but actually that's because there's so much you can learn from it. So I think pick the sort of metrics that work best for you to help you understand and explore your rights business best. But I think if you've got a bigger business particularly, then it would make sense to have multiple win rates.
Do rights teams typically make decisions about their positioning, or is it handed down via management or past practice?
I think actually there's quite a lot of latitude in rights teams, because often in my experience, they're often a bit sort of left to their own devices. So I think in terms of how you position yourself as a rights team, that should be within the rights team's control. But obviously you've got that positioning as a publisher, which probably you are a contributor to, but probably don't have as much or any influence over. But I think if you take an interest in it, you can certainly talk to marketing colleagues and kind of ask them to explain to you how they see the business as being positioned in the marketplace. Because again, just understanding that will help you in your customer conversations.
Fabulous. Well, those are the questions that we had. Thank you so much for an incredibly informative and really, really helpful presentation, Claire, and Chris for adding your insight and questions that really helped kick us off and guide the discussion there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
For having me.
Thank you. Just as
Thanks,
a reminder
Claire.
for folks that this session was recorded, so everyone's going to get that recording shortly. And if you're interested in learning more about our rights committee or the royalty statement standards working group, those links are right there. Feel free to reach out to BISG. I'm also Brooke at bisg.org and happy to answer any questions that you have as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Claire and Chris.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.